In 1951, Alan Watts published a book with a title that was, for its time, almost deliberately provocative. He called it The Wisdom of Insecurity. The argument was not complicated. It did not require a philosophy degree to understand. It could be stated in a single sentence. Human suffering is not caused by what happens to a person, but by a hidden and almost universally unexamined belief that what is happening should not be happening. Watts was not the first person to notice this. The Pali texts of early Buddhism had named the same mechanism 25 centuries earlier. The Taoist tradition had built an entire metaphysics around its recognition. What Watts added was a diagnostic precision, the ability to name the mechanism in language a modern person could actually hear. He was not offering a cure. He was insisting there is no cure, and that the search for one is itself the disease. Most people reading this have spent significant portions of their lives in a particular state. Not depression necessarily, not catastrophe. Something quieter and harder to locate. A persistent low-grade sense that this moment is slightly wrong, that something that happened should not have happened, or that something that has not yet arrived should already be here. That life is, in some structural and difficult to articulate way, off track. You do not always know what track it should be on. You just know it is not on it. And so, beneath whatever you are doing right now, the reading, the working, the eating, the conversation, there is a secondary process running, a slow, almost imperceptible argument with what is. This argument is not loud. It does not announce itself, but it is constant, and it is exhausting in a way that sleep does not fix. What generates it is not life. What generates it is a belief so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the architecture of ordinary thinking, that it has stopped appearing as a belief at all. It appears instead as reality. It is the belief that experience should be other than it is. Now, I want you to look at this from a different altitude. Imagine watching a person from above, not critically, not with judgment, purely anthropologically. What you see is someone who wakes each morning and immediately, before coffee, before conversation, begins a quiet and largely unconscious evaluation of the day against some internal template of how the day should go. Not a deliberate evaluation. An automatic one. The template is not written anywhere. No one handed it to the person explicitly. It assembled itself gradually from childhood expectation, cultural inheritance, the accumulated residue of wanting things to go well and watching them go otherwise. By the time the person is an adult, the template is invisible. It has merged with what they call their sense of reality. When the day matches the template, the person feels what they call fine. When the day diverges from it, the person feels what they call bad. They interpret this feeling as the day's fault. From above, you can see something the person cannot see from inside. The template and the day are two separate things. The day is what is happening. The template is a construct, a mental model of what should be happening. The gap between them is not a property of the day. It is a property of the template. Change the template, and the exact same day feels different. But the person inside the experience does not typically interrogate the template. The template is invisible. It has the texture of common sense, of basic reasonableness, of obvious truth. And so when the gap opens, the person does what seems logical. They try to close it by changing the day, or they suffer the gap, as though it were an injury caused by external forces. What they rarely do, what no one has ever quite taught them to do, is question whether the template itself is the problem. Watts put this more precisely. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts made an observation that does not age well in the comfortable sense of that phrase. It does not comfort, it dislocates. He wrote that the source of human suffering is not the circumstances of a person's life, but the mind's fundamental insistence on dividing experience into categories of acceptable and unacceptable, and then treating that division as though it were a feature of reality rather than a structure imposed upon it. The world, Watts argued, does not arrive pre-sorted. It does not come labeled, "this should be here," and "this should not be here." It arrives as pure, undivided event. The sorting is done by the mind, using categories inherited from a culture that has not examined them clearly in several thousand years. In his lectures at the Esalen Institute in the late 1960s, Watts returned to this idea repeatedly and found different ways to make it visible. In one, he used an image that has stayed in circulation because it captures the mechanism with unusual precision. He described the ego, the narrative self, the voice inside that manages the person's experience, as an entity that is perpetually trying to bite its own teeth. The ego wants to see itself, the way an eye wants to see itself without a mirror. It constructs mirrors everywhere, in other people's reactions, in achievement, in the story it tells about what it is, and whether that story is being confirmed. But the act of looking is never the thing being looked at. There is always a gap, and in that gap lives the persistent suspicion that something is wrong. The illusion Watts was pointing at is not an unusual state of consciousness. It is not a neurotic condition requiring treatment. It is, he contended, the ordinary condition of anyone who has been shaped by a culture that teaches the individual self to be the primary unit of existence, and who has never been shown what the teaching costs. The mechanism deserves careful anatomical attention, because its structure is counterintuitive, and it is almost never described precisely. The suffering in question is not caused by bad things happening. This is the first and most important clarification. It is not that pain, loss, disappointment, and failure exist. They do, and they cause suffering. What is being pointed at here is something additional and separate, the suffering that is layered on top of whatever is actually happening by the act of insisting it should not be happening. The Theravada Buddhist tradition gave this a technical name, dukkha dukkha, the second arrow. The first arrow is the event. The second arrow is the mind's response to the event. The demand that the event should not have occurred, the outrage and resistance and urgent need to undo what cannot be undone. The first arrow may be unavoidable. The second arrow is the one we fire ourselves. To understand why the second arrow is so reliably fired, you have to understand what the mind is doing when it evaluates experience. The evaluating mind, what cognitive psychology sometimes calls the narrative self, what Watts called the ego, is not neutral. It is not a calm observer recording what happens. It is a system whose primary function is to manage the individual's relationship to the environment by maintaining a model of how things should go, monitoring for deviations from that model, and generating signals when deviations occur. Those signals feel like discomfort. They are supposed to. In contexts where the deviation is actionable, a physical threat, a solvable problem, a reversible decision, the discomfort is useful. It drives action. The system works exactly as designed. The problem begins when the deviation is not actionable, when the thing that should not have happened has happened and cannot be undone, when the way things are is precisely the way they are, regardless of preference. In those cases, the system keeps generating the signal anyway, because the signal is not predicated on whether action is possible. It is predicated only on the existence of a gap between what is and what should be. And if the what should be is held in place, if the template is maintained, then the gap remains and the signal keeps firing and the suffering continues, not because the situation is bad, but because the evaluation has not been turned off. This is the illusion stated mechanically. You are suffering not because life is wrong, but because you are holding, in parallel with life, a model of life that says it should be different. Remove the model and the suffering, not the event, but the layer of suffering layered onto the event, does not necessarily disappear, but it changes character. It becomes the event itself, clean, without the additional weight of being a failure, without the editorial. But here is the deeper layer of the anatomy, and it is the layer that makes the whole thing so structurally resistant to examination. The person who is suffering under this mechanism is almost never aware that the template exists. They experience the template and reality as a single thing. The gap between what is and what should be does not feel like a cognitive construct. It feels like an obvious objective fact. It feels like something is genuinely wrong here, not my model of things says something is wrong here, just wrong, directly, simply, factually wrong. And so the natural response is to try to fix the wrongness, to change the situation or to change oneself, or to find the person or institution responsible for the wrongness and address them. What is almost never natural, what requires a very specific kind of instruction that most cultures do not offer, is to question the judgment of wrongness itself, to ask not, how do I fix what is wrong, but what is actually generating the experience of wrong, to trace the sense of wrongness back through the mind's evaluation system to the template that produced it, and to examine that template directly. Watts observed, and this is the move that almost every tradition of wisdom arrives at from different directions, that when the template is examined, it tends not to survive examination, not because it is obviously ridiculous, but because it becomes visible, and visibility is fatal to the illusion. The template only functions as reality when it is invisible. The moment you can see it as a template, as a mental model, as a preference, as a story, it can no longer pretend to be what is actually happening. Here's the paradox that runs through everything described so far. The ordinary human response to suffering is to try to end it. This seems obvious. This seems rational. What else would a person do? And so, the suffering person constructs strategies. They try to fix the circumstances. They try to change their thinking. They try to develop resilience. They try meditation. They try therapy. They try gratitude journaling. They try acceptance. And this is where the mechanism doubles back on itself and becomes, in Watts' language, a game rigged against the player. Every attempt to end the suffering by a deliberate act of will reinforces the very structure that produces the suffering. Because the act of trying to stop suffering requires, as its foundation, the belief that suffering should not be happening. The person who sits down to practice acceptance is, in the very act of beginning to practice, asserting that the current state is unacceptable. The gap between what is and what should be has not been closed. It has been renamed. Now the gap is between person who is suffering and person who should be accepting their suffering. And this new gap produces its own friction, its own quiet emergency. Watts was precise about this in a lecture he gave in 1970, collected in what was later published as The Essential Alan Watts. He described the person who says, "I need to be more spontaneous." The immediate structural impossibility of the statement, the way the act of deciding to be spontaneous guarantees that what follows will be deliberate rather than spontaneous. The same logic applies to acceptance, to presence, to peace of mind. The moment they become goals, the moment a person decides they should achieve them, they retreat structurally. They cannot be achieved. They can only arise in the absence of the demand that they arise. This is the central paradox, and it is not resolvable by cleverness. You cannot think your way out of a trap whose walls are made of thought. The ego that is suffering cannot fix the suffering, because the ego is the source of the frame within which the suffering occurs. A hand cannot grab itself. An eye cannot see itself without a mirror. The self that is trying to stop suffering is the same self whose evaluative function is generating the suffering. This is the moment when almost every self-help tradition quietly changes the subject. Because the logical conclusion of the analysis is uncomfortable, there is no technique, because technique is an extension of the same mechanism causing the problem. There is no practice, because practice is a goal, and goals are the language of the gap. What there might be is something different, something closer to understanding than to effort, something that happens to the person rather than something the person does. And this is precisely where the Eastern traditions become indispensable, because they have been exploring this territory for thousands of years, and they have not flinched from the implications. The first of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths is often translated into English as, "Life is suffering." This translation is technically defensible, but philosophically misleading. The Pali word is dukkha, and its semantic range is wider than the English word suffering captures. It includes suffering, yes, but also dissatisfaction, unease, impermanence, the friction of holding something that cannot be held. A more precise translation might be, experience has an inherent quality of not quite rightness, not wrongness, not tragedy, just a structural quality of not landing quite right, not fitting quite perfectly. The way a wheel whose axle is even slightly off-center will never roll without vibration, regardless of the quality of the road. The second noble truth is the one that maps precisely onto the mechanism Watts was describing. The cause of dukkha is tanha, craving, thirst, the demand that experience be other than it is. Not the event itself, not the impermanence itself, the craving for permanence in the face of impermanence, the wanting things to be other, the second arrow. The Buddha's teaching on this point is radical in its precision and often misrepresented in popular translation. It does not say that desire itself is the problem. Tanha is a particular kind of desire, the desire rooted in the illusion of a permanent, separate self, whose satisfaction or dissatisfaction is the measure of reality. It is not desire that must be extinguished. It is the belief that the desiring self is a fixed, bounded, permanent entity whose demands the universe is obligated to meet. In the Zen tradition, this is approached through the practice of pointing directly at the mechanisms that sustain the illusion of the separate self, not philosophically, but through direct inquiry that makes the mechanism visible in real time. The koan mu, given by the Chinese master Zhaozhou in the 9th century, is not a puzzle to be solved by reasoning. It is a mechanism for bringing the reasoning mind to its own limit. When the student keeps pressing mu with every answer, when no conceptual move satisfies the question, the student is not being taught something new. They are being invited to notice what was there all along, underneath the layer of perpetual evaluation. The Taoist tradition reaches the same territory from a different direction. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu does not argue against desire or experience or even suffering. He points at something more fundamental: the way water moves. Water does not argue with the stones in its path. It does not form a policy of resistance to elevation and insist on going uphill. It finds the lower place effortlessly, without deliberation, without a template of where it should end up. The concept of wu wei, often translated as non-doing or effortless action, is not passivity. It is action without the overlay of a self insisting that the action confirm its preferred image of the world. The river does not celebrate reaching the sea. It does not mourn the bends in its path. It moves, and the moving is the whole of it. Watts found in Taoism a vocabulary that Western philosophical traditions had not developed. In Tao, the Watercourse Way, published posthumously in 1975, he translated the Taoist insight into language that lands in contemporary consciousness without the distance of exoticism. The pattern is not become like water as a self-improvement instruction. The pattern is more fundamental, the recognition that you already are like water, that the nature you are attempting to improve is already continuous with the nature of things, and that the improvement project is itself the source of the gap. The contemporary science says something similar, in different language. In clinical psychology, the framework that has come closest to operationalizing what Watts and the Buddhist tradition were describing is acceptance and commitment therapy. Developed by Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada, beginning in the mid-1980s and now among the most empirically validated therapeutic approaches in existence. The central concept in ACT, and the one that is most relevant here, is what Hayes calls experiential avoidance, the process by which a person attempts to control, suppress, or escape from unwanted private experiences, including thoughts, feelings, memories, and bodily sensations. What Hayes and his colleagues found, across decades of clinical research, is that experiential avoidance does not reduce suffering, it amplifies it. The more consistently a person uses their cognitive and behavioral resources to avoid internal experience, the more rigid and dominant that experience becomes. Suppressed thoughts return with greater frequency and intensity than unsuppressed thoughts. Avoided emotions accumulate. The strategy designed to minimize discomfort increases the overall burden of discomfort across the person's life. Hayes measured this with clinical precision. The mechanism Watts was pointing at in philosophical terms turns out to be empirically documented in psychological terms. The alternative Hayes proposes is not the elimination of the unwanted experience. It is what he calls psychological flexibility, the capacity to be present with experience as it is, including painful experience, without the overlay of a self that insists the experience should be different. In the language of ACT, this is called diffusion from the content of experience. Not the content changing, but the person's relationship to it shifting. The experience is still there. The demand that it not be there has been loosened. The parallel to the Buddhist and Wattsian analysis is not accidental. Hayes was explicit about drawing on Buddhist philosophy as a theoretical foundation for the ACT framework. The mechanism is the same. What changes is the vocabulary and the method of verification. In 2010, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert published a study in Science using a smartphone application to sample the thoughts of 2,250 adults at random intervals throughout their days. They found that human beings spend approximately 47% of their waking hours not attending to what they are actually doing, thinking instead about something other than the present activity, typically about the past or the future. More significantly for this analysis, they found that this mind wandering correlated with lower reported happiness, regardless of the content of the wandering thoughts. People who were thinking about pleasant topics while their minds wandered were less happy than people who were fully present to unpleasant tasks. The source of unhappiness was not the content of experience. It was the absence of presence to experience, the mind's habitual preference for the template of what should be happening over the raw event of what is. Killingsworth and Gilbert titled their paper, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." The mechanism it documents has no obvious cure inside its own framework. You cannot decide to stop mind wandering. The attempt to monitor and suppress mind wandering is itself a form of mind wandering because it is a thinking about thinking rather than a presence to experience. What the data describes is not a failure of individuals, but a structural feature of the ordinary human relationship to experience, one that functions in precisely the way Watts, Hayes, Lao Tzu, and the Buddha were describing from completely different starting points. This convergence is significant. It is not the convergence of traditions that all happen to arrive at the same belief. It is the convergence of independent observations, philosophical, clinical, empirical, pointing at the same phenomenon. The phenomenon is real. What differs is the conceptual framework used to describe it and the method used to investigate it. The phenomenon itself does not belong to any tradition. There is one additional layer of the anatomy that deserves examination before the reframe, and it is the one that makes the illusion most resistant to dissolution. The belief that life should be other than it is does not feel like a belief. This point cannot be overstated. It feels like a perception. It feels like seeing. When a person experiences the gap between what is and what should be, the experience is not, "my model says this is wrong." The experience is, "this is wrong." The wrongness feels given, not constructed. It feels external, not generated. And this is why philosophical instruction alone does not typically dissolve the illusion, even when the person intellectually understands and agrees with every point in the analysis. Understanding the mechanism and being free of the mechanism are not the same thing. Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Indian sage whose teaching centered on direct self-inquiry, made this distinction with surgical economy. He was not interested in philosophical debate about the nature of suffering. He was interested in a single question that he applied to every manifestation of psychological distress. To whom is this happening? Not, is this happening? It may well be. Not, should this be happening? That is the trap. But who is the one claiming to suffer this? What is the self that is generating the report of wrongness? Can that self find itself? The inquiry Maharshi proposed is not rhetorical. It is a direct instruction to look, not at the object of suffering, but at the subject. The person who is suffering turns their attention to the entity that is doing the suffering and discovers something that does not fit the expectation. The entity that was going to be found, the separate, bounded, permanent self whose template is being violated, is not findable as a thing. It is findable only as a process, a movement, a series of evaluations, none of which has a fixed address. Watts translated this insight into Western phenomenological language in the book On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, published in 1966. The self, Watts argued, is not a thing inside the body. It is a process, a conversation between the organism and its environment, a temporarily localized eddy in the flow of a single undivided reality. The self that is suffering the gap is the same self that constructed the template that created the gap. It is not a victim. It is an architecture that happens to be experiencing its own output as external reality. This is not a comfortable observation. It has no immediate practical application. What it does is relocate the problem from "the world is wrong" to "the process by which the world is evaluated as wrong." And that relocation, even when it does not immediately dissolve the suffering, changes its character. The suffering becomes visible as something generated rather than received. And things that are generated have a different quality than things that simply are. And here is what changes. And it is not what most people expect. The reframe that emerges from this analysis is not, "everything is fine." It is not, "nothing matters." It is not the flat, effectless equanimity of someone who has simply given up caring. The suffering is real. The events are real. Pain, loss, failure, grief. These are not illusions. What is the illusion is the belief embedded in the experience of these things. The belief that their occurrence is a violation of the natural order, that they are errors, that a properly functioning universe would not have produced them. When that specific belief, the one that sits beneath the suffering and generates the additional layer of resistance, becomes visible as a belief rather than as a perception of reality, something shifts. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it is a quiet loosening of a grip that the person did not know they were holding. The event remains what it is. The pain remains what it is. But the argument with the event, the case being filed with the universe for why this should not be happening, becomes recognizable as a case being filed. And the moment you can see yourself filing it, you can also see that the filing is optional, not that you will immediately stop. Habits of mind do not dissolve through comprehension alone. What Watts called the new angle of vision does not eliminate the old angle. It sits alongside it, increasingly available, requiring less and less effort to find. In the Taoist tradition, this is not described as enlightenment or achievement or arrival. It is described with a word that does not translate perfectly into English. Zhuozhou, sometimes rendered as self-so or naturally so. Things as they are, of themselves, without the overlay of how they should be. Not as an ideal to be reached, but as a recognition, a noticing of what was already the case before the template arrived. There is one more thing to notice, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive part of the whole architecture. The illusion that life should be other than it is does not exist despite the fact that you are an intelligent, reflective, philosophically curious person. It exists because of it. The same cognitive capacity that allows you to model the future, to learn from the past, to imagine alternatives, to plan and adjust and improve, that same capacity is precisely the one that generates the gap. The ability to conceive of how things could be different is inseparable from the experience of how things are as insufficient. The technology of human consciousness that makes culture, science, art, and civilization possible is the same technology that makes the persistent background dissatisfaction possible. This is why Watts resisted any suggestion that the solution was to become less conscious, less reflective, less capable of conceptual thought. That would be to confuse the instrument with the use being made of it. The self-evaluating mind is not the problem. The invisibility of its operation is the problem. When the evaluation becomes visible as evaluation, when the template is seen as a template rather than experienced as reality, the instrument remains intact. What changes is the relationship to it. The person is no longer inside the machine without knowing it. They are able to see the machine and, in seeing it, to choose in moments to set it down. Not forever, not with finality. The machine is loud and old and well established. It does not retire because of a single philosophical recognition. But the moments of setting it down, the moments of being present to what is without the additional weight of what should be, are available more often than they were. And they are available not as achievements of a spiritual practice, not as the fruits of discipline, not as the reward for effort. They are available as what happens in the absence of the illusion, effortlessly, the way water finds the lower place. The argument with life is still running. It is running right now, in the background of whatever you are doing, as reliably as it was when you first started reading this. It is not going to stop because you have understood what it is. Understanding is not the same as freedom, but there is a difference, a quiet, real difference, between running an argument you cannot see and running an argument you can. The unseen argument feels like reality. The seen argument feels like a habit. And habits, unlike reality, have the quality of being something you are doing rather than something that is happening to you. Watts, in a lecture in 1969, described this with characteristic economy. The only way to make sense of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. Not to stop the dance, not to improve the dance, not to audit the dance for errors and correct them. To join what is already happening from inside the happening without the continuous reservation about whether this particular dance should be occurring at all. The reservation is the illusion. What it conceals, what it has always concealed, is that there was nothing wrong with the dance.